But let me come back to some of my personal story, because when my wife and I first went to visit A Rocha in Portugal, which was in 1994, she was sitting in a wheelchair. She'd been ill by that stage for about 8 years with the condition ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, sometimes known as chronic fatigue syndrome. And Anne had had it particularly badly. She, at that stage, wasn't able to walk up and down stairs at all. She had to be carried. She couldn't walk more than a few yards. She had to use a wheelchair. She couldn't actually hold cutlery steadily enough to eat. She had to have all her food cut up for her. She couldn't lift a kettle in order to fill it with water. So she had it very, very severely, and she was quite severely disabled. And through those 8 or so years that Anne struggled with ME, with chronic fatigue syndrome, we wrestled as a couple with a belief in a God who is sovereign and who is supreme and who is good, and yet the fact that there is apparently meaningless suffering going on in the world in many, many different ways. And we knew that Anne's experience and our experience as a couple was only a tiny example, and that many, many people have far worse suffering. And yet we were wrestling with this, and people said, go here and get prayed for and you'll be healed. Read this, do that, pray the other, and everything will be sorted out. And we tried everything. But still, Anne remained quite ill physically. Sometimes when she was prayed for, she would have a sense of peace and a sense of God's presence. And slowly, slowly, slowly during that time, both of us, and Anne in particular, came to a real sense that actually God was working through the illness in her and through her within us as a couple. And that God was doing a very deep work in shaping her personality, in shaping her sensitivity to the sufferings of others, in enabling her to have gifts of empathy and understanding that she would not have had otherwise, had she not spent those 8 years quite severely unwell. And after that visit to Portugal and after 8 years or so of that illness, she'd really reached a point where we could quite clearly say that if God wanted her to remain in the wheelchair, remain with ME, which her particular experience of it was that it was almost continual chronic pain as well. Quite severe pain in the joints and the glands. Varied a bit from day to day, but almost every day. But Anne felt that if God wanted her to continue with that, then if he could use it, and if that was part of his plan and his purpose, then that was okay. And that was obviously, for me, only a second-hand experience. But I could understand that. I could obviously admire that as well. And I could see that in many ways, God was already able to use Anne in her illness in a way that he wouldn't have been able to use her or me if we had been healthy in conventional ways. And one tiny, tiny example of that is when we moved into a church that I was in Southall at the time. It was a church that was full of unconfident people. People who, for all sorts of reasons, had been done down by life. People who'd been pushed around, who'd been abused, sometimes physically, sometimes in their work experience, sometimes just in terms of life's opportunities. And if I realised that if we had come into that church with me as a sort of new young leader who'd got all the answers, then actually it would have just further damaged many of those people. But when we arrived in that church, actually weak, helpless, and in need of help from others, it became something empowering that enabled others to actually help us, and through that to find that they had gifts and that they were useful. And that itself is its own story, some of which is in the book. And then something quite extraordinary and unexpected happened, which was that we went to a meeting in a church where there was a time of prayer just for a refreshing, a refilling of God's Spirit. And both Anne and I felt, yes, we could do with a bit of that. And we both asked for prayer, as most people at that meeting did. Both of us not expecting anything in the way of physical healing. Anne had been pushed into the meeting in her wheelchair and was sitting very self-consciously in the front row because that was the only place where there was space for a wheelchair. Now what happened then was that as Anne was prayed for and I was somewhere else being prayed for and didn't really experience this, Anne had a most unexpected experience of God's presence. And she said it felt like being under a waterfall of love, just a continually flowing waterfall of God's love. And as she looked up, she had a very vivid picture of Jesus walking around this room in the form of Aslan, the great lion in the books of Narnia, just gently coming up to people and touching them. And sometimes just putting his paw on their back. Sometimes they would fall over. Sometimes they would just kind of maybe shake a bit or something like that as they were touched. And she had a sense that she was being touched too. And from that day onwards, apart from a tiny, tiny relapse 2 days later, and again, because of time, I haven't got time to go into the details in a huge amount, Anne has been free of her ME, her chronic fatigue syndrome. And that in a sense gave us a problem. It was a wonderful problem because within a very few weeks, as her muscles recovered their energy, she was able to walk up and down stairs. We went straight to the doctor the next week and said, look, we've got this disability allowance and we've got this badge for the car and we don't think we need them anymore. And the doctor was sensible and said, come back in 2 months' time and we'll see. And so we came back in 2 months' time and he did all the tests and he said, I cannot explain this, but you seem to be completely recovered. But it did give us a problem because we had really known God working powerfully in suffering and in weakness. And here suddenly we were getting lots of invitations as word got out to come and speak about healing and about the secret and about how other people could be healed. And we actually made a resolution, which I think we've kept until this day, that was we would never talk about healing without also talking about suffering and about a God who's at work in both, powerfully, and who can work through both.